Hello, welcome to the second video lesson on Introduction to Feminist Criticism. In the previous video, we gave a basic introduction to concepts like feminism and feminist literary criticism, and also began talking about the history of feminism by discussing what is called first wave feminism. So this is based on the general idea, the widespread popular idea that the history of feminism can be understood in different waves. So in this video, we will look at the second wave of feminism. We mentioned that the first wave of feminism was mostly in the 19th century and the first couple of decades of the 20th century, and it was mostly about winning the right to vote and certain other rights like property rights for women. Second wave feminism was supposed to be from the 1960s to 1980s. So the first wave is supposed to have ended around 1920s or 1930 with the winning of the right to vote. And then during the Second World War and for a short while after, there was a lull in feminism, in the feminist movement. But by the 1960s, women had started feeling quite discontent. The immediate threat of the Second World War had passed, and the 1950s was a more or less calm decade for America and European countries, mostly, even though there was the threat of the rapidly escalating Cold War that was going on at that time, but still it was more or less a calm time for ordinary citizens of these countries, and that probably again started women thinking about their own position in society, and a new wave, a second wave of feminist movement rose up in the 1960s. And this wave was influenced a lot by the protests against the Vietnam War and also the civil rights movement in the United States, which was trying to gain all the equal rights for black people. The main concern of the second wave feminism was the female body itself and its representations and the meanings attached to biological difference. So, how was the female body imagined or represented in literature and in other cultural texts? And what are the ways in which people understood the body itself? And what are the cultural meanings that are attached to the biological difference between men and women? So, there were a lot of intense discussions around this issue. Are men and women essentially different? Is there any essential, fundamental biological difference between men and women which results in them being completely different kinds of beings? That was a question that was debated a lot during second wave feminism. At a practical level, second wave feminists also campaigned for women's rights for things like equal pay for equal work, because at that time women had the right to employment, but they were still being paid less than men working in the same jobs. So one of the campaign slogans of that time was equal pay for equal work. And they also campaigned for reproductive rights. So this meant that women should have control over their own bodies. They should have the right to contraception, to birth control, to decide whether or not they could get pregnant. It was not something that was, until then it was left to the man to decide that. In a sense, women did not have much right over their bodies, and also when you talk about reproductive rights, there was also a campaign for the right to abortion, which is again part of claiming a woman's control over her own body. So these were some of the rights that second wave feminists fought for. Second wave feminism is also known for the famous slogan, the personal is the political. This slogan emphasized the associations between personal experience and larger social and political structures. So, if you see a problem that a woman is facing in what is considered the personal sphere, like the family, the domestic, the intimate, etc., that is not necessarily just a personal problem of that woman, but rather it is related to problems of patriarchy that structure the entire society. Larger social and political structures influence what is happening inside our family or inside our personal spaces. Similarly, the personal experience of women is also connected to what is happening out there in society in general. Now, this is important. This move towards the personal by saying personal is the political differentiates second wave feminism from first wave feminism, where the main impetus was to move, it was for women to move away from the domain of the personal, away from the home, the domestic domain, etc., into the public. So, first wave feminism was mostly interested in saying that women should not be forced to sit inside the home and be just mothers, wives, etc. And they should have the right to go out, to work, to get education, to vote, and to participate actively in public life. So, the interest or the focus in first wave feminism was away from the private or the personal domain and into the public. Whereas in second wave feminism, there is a re-foregrounding there is a foregrounding of the personal in a completely new way, which is not to say that we should go back and sit at home, but rather to say that all this while we have been talking about the rights that women could have outside the personal space, outside the family, etc., in society. But now we should also talk about what kind of work are women doing inside the house and what kind of roles are they playing. Is there any equality inside the house? What are the power structures inside the family, etc.? So, there is a way of coming back to personal issues, and this doesn't mean just the domain of the family, but also, as I said earlier, personal issues are also those related to women's bodies themselves. So, having control of your own body and what is your attitude towards your own body, all these things were discussed by second wave feminism. Now, second wave feminism is generally considered to have two strands. They can be geographically divided into Anglo-American strand, the Anglo-American strand of second wave feminism, which is basically the second wave feminists who are based in England and America, and also the French or the European strand of second wave feminism. What is the basis of this geographical difference? It is not just that, it's not just about geographical territories where feminism expanded in different ways, but also the focus of Anglo-American feminism was very different from French second wave feminism. Anglo-American feminism was mostly based on praxis. That means, how do we apply all these theories that we are talking about in our practice? How do we practice feminism? How do we practically deal with feminism? That was one of their interests. And generally, Anglo-American feminists are considered to be much more radical because they were more concerned with going out in the streets and campaigning, really fighting for the rights of women. French feminism, on the other hand, was considered to be much more theoretical. And, among all the different kinds of theories, they had a very special affinity for psychoanalytic theories. So they used theory, post-structural theory and psychoanalytic theory especially, in order to theorize women's experience, women's language, women's bodies, etc. So Anglo-American feminism was much more practical and French feminism was much more theoretical. Now let us look at some of the important figures who influence second wave feminism or who are associated with this movement. the second wave of feminism was influenced by one very important person, the French existential feminist philosopher Simone de Beauvoir. Simone de Beauvoir is known for her path-breaking work, The Second Sex, that was published in 1949. And this is a very important or famous quote of hers where she says that one is not born but rather becomes a woman. One is not born a woman, but rather one becomes a woman. So here she is talking about the social construction of gender and about how the society is generally constructed in such a way that men are the ones who set the terms of this construction, and women end up being constructed according to terms which are not their own. And that is how, when you are born, you're just a baby. But as you grow up, you are socialized, you are socially conditioned, and you end up normatively acquiring those qualities that society associates with women. That is how you become a woman, through socialization. She argued that men position themselves as the self or the subject and see women as the other or the object. So in the previous video, we had talked about this difference between self and other. So that is what she says, that men position themselves as the self or subject, which means that they are the ones who lay down all the rules, and all the structures of society have been designed from the perspective of men. And women are seen as the other, as someone who's very different, fundamentally different from men, and as someone who is the object of all their discourses, of all their institutions, etc. So to say that someone is an object is to say that they don't have agency, they don't have the ability to make changes in the world, they don't have the ability to take responsibility for their own lives, but rather they are always under the control of somebody else. So these are things that Simone de Beauvoir points out in The Second Sex. And she exhorted women through her book to question this othering and this objectification through gender stereotypes that prevail in society. And the camp liberal feminists did during the second wave for equal pay for equal work was also inspired by the work of Simone de Beauvoir. But whether Simone de Beauvoir can be considered a second wave feminist is a doubtful thing. Some histories of feminism include her under that, and some other histories say that no, she's not somebody who would associate herself with second wave feminism. But definitely the second wave of feminism was inspired by Simone de Beauvoir, her work The Second Sex, and her proclamation that one is not born but rather becomes a woman. Now we move on to the two strands of second wave feminism that we already mentioned. We will begin with the Anglo-American strand. The Anglo-American strand of second wave feminism can be said to draw its inspiration from the work of Betty Friedan, who wrote a book titled The Feminine Mystique in 1963. In this book, she talks about something that she calls the problem that has no name. The problem that has no name, which according to her is a problem affecting women during the 1950s and early 1960s. So what she said is that 1950s and 1960s was a time of relative calm and prosperity, especially for America. She was an American. But the problem was that a lot of middle class women, especially in America, were already educated. And because of the rights that were won by first wave feminism, they were already educated, and they would read and they would think and all that, but still they were constrained to remain within their houses, within their domestic spaces, in the roles of housewives and mothers. And if you look at it from outside, it looks as if these women have absolutely nothing lacking. They have loving husband, children, they have all sorts of technologies that will help them, like all the kitchen implements, the electrical and electronic items that you use in the kitchen were all invented and popularized during this time. So it looks as if these women had a lot of free time, during which they started feeling a particular kind of melancholy, a particular kind of unhappiness, which other people would not understand. So people would think, what is wrong with these women? They have everything. Why are they unhappy? And this is why Betty Friedan calls it the problem that has no name. And in this book, The Feminine Mystique, she questions the patriarchal idea that women experience fulfillment by devoting their lives to being housewives and mothers. So she's saying that you may have everything physically, you may have everything that you need, all your physical needs are met, and you have even a lot of prosperity, you have what seems like a happy family, but still, if your creativity is restricted, if your potential is restricted, then you cannot be completely happy. So this is the problem that has no name. Some other important figures include Germaine Greer, who wrote a book titled The Female Eunuch in 1970, in which she discusses how the gender roles prescribed by patriarchy strips women of their sexual desires. So at that time, the patriarchal gender roles held that they did not believe that women could have sexual desires. And the very fact that a woman could want to fulfill her sexual desires was something that the patriarchal society at that time could not even imagine. So Germaine Greer foregrounded this in her book, The Female Eunuch, by talking about the importance of a woman's sexual desire and how that is again related to her creativity. Another important figure in Anglo-American second wave feminism was Kate Millet, who wrote a very important book titled Sexual Politics, which was also published in 1970, in which she discusses the political aspect of sex as represented in literary works by authors like D.H. Lawrence, Henry Miller, Norman Mailer, etc. So in the work of Germaine Greer and Kate Millet, we can see the importance that is given to sex and sexuality, to the body. And we mentioned that this kind of concern with the body is very important to second wave feminism, because before that, women's bodies and their bodily desires and the problems related to their body were considered to be something that you don't talk about in public. But this particular strand of second wave feminism brought those kind of questions out into the public. Another important work in Anglo-American feminism was the publication of a book titled Mad Woman in the Attic in 1979. It was co-written by Sandra Gilbert and Susan Beauvoir. In this book, mostly it is a work of literary criticism in which these two authors, Gilbert and Beauvoir, look at the trope of the mad woman in Victorian literature. And they argue that this particular trope, there are many such Victorian works in which you have a mad woman character. One of the most famous works with a mad woman character is, of course, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. But there are many other works with that kind of a trope. And Gilbert and Beauvoir said that in the Victorian age, authors were forced to conform to stereotypical representations of women. Women would be represented either as angels or as monsters. And this led to a certain kind of tension in the mind of authors, especially women authors. And that tension it came to be expressed in the form of this trope of the mad woman who stands between this angel and the monster. Another very important feminist critic who was part of the Anglo-American strand was Elaine Sisu, who, among many other contributions that she made, she proposed a new model of analyzing women's writing according to a new framework based on women's experience. And this new model of feminist criticism, she called it Gynocritics. So, in Gynocritics, according to Elaine Sisu, you look at writing by women and you analyze that writing not according to some existing theoretical framework which are mostly developed by men like Marxism, psychoanalysis, etc. All those, many of those are developed by male thinkers and male philosophers and male writers, and because of that, knowingly or unknowingly, those theoretical frameworks also are entrenched in patriarchy in some way or the other. So instead of analyzing women's writings by using male constructed frameworks, or analyzing texts produced by male authors from a woman's point of view, instead of doing those things, Elaine Sisu says that in Gynocritics, we will form a new method, a new theoretical framework based on women's experience, and we will use that to analyze women's writing. And this was especially opposed to the traditional feminist model of rereading texts written by male authors. The problem with that is that there's still, even if you are reinterpreting or rereading or criticizing works that are written by male authors from a feminist perspective, even then the problem is that you will end up focusing on those male authors and their works. So you will end up looking at their representations of women and try to argue whether those representations are true to reality or not. And this is a problem because in many of those works, first of all, women would be represented as some kind of victims, as we mentioned, according to the stereotypes of angels or monsters, or as victims, and we will tend to then just look at women as victims rather than we looking at the creativity of women themselves, for which purpose we have to look at women's own writing. And to be just to women's own writing, we have to use a new framework that is based on women's experience. And therefore, Elaine Sisu wanted feminist literary critics to focus on also creating a history of forgotten female writers to trace patterns of influence among them. Now we will move on to the French school of New Wave Feminism, or which can also be called French feminism. The main authors or the main critics in this strand are Julia Kristeva, Elaine Sisu, Luz Irigaray, and Monique Wittig, among others. French feminists followed the post-structural and psychoanalytic tradition. So they took many concepts and theoretical frameworks from post-structuralism and from psychoanalysis, from the works of critics like Jacques Lacan, Jacques Derrida, etc. And then they applied those, or they adapted those in order to foreground their feminist concerns. And these French feminists were disappointed by liberal feminism, which was all about asking for rights, and they were also disappointed by the limitations of social equality theory. So they said it's not enough to say that men and women are equal. They should be treated equally by the state, by society, by all the institutions of society. We should have equal pay for equal work, equal voting rights, etc. That is not enough. That is a very limited discourse, and rather they wanted to focus more on women's body, women's experience, etc., especially through the study of language. And second wave French feminists questioned the very nature of language itself as masculine or as patriarchal. They said language itself is structured by patriarchy, and instead of that, they wanted a new kind of language which is characterized by, which is elusive, which is poetic and full of linguistic puns. So the normal language that we use, traditional language that we use, according to these French feminists, that language is patriarchal in nature, and it is very linear in some ways, it is very rational in some ways, and we should have a language that is more feminine and which is much more poetic rather than being rational, which has a lot of allusions, which has a lot of references to many different things. So these are the kind of this is a new kind of language that French feminists wanted. We'll talk about that a bit more in the next slide. But apart from this, French feminists also questioned the binary oppositions between male and female, mind and body, order and disorder, light and darkness, reason and emotion, etc. This is again, this questioning of binary oppositions was something that they borrowed from the post-structural tradition. And according to these binary oppositions that supposedly structure society, the world can be divided into, for example, human beings can be divided into male and female, of which the male is always privileged over the female. Then one human being can be divided into mind and body, of which mind is supposed to be better than the body. The mind is supposed to be privileged over the body. Similarly, with reason and emotion, reason is supposed to be privileged over emotion. And this particular set of binary oppositions, according to these feminists, is patriarchal in nature, because all these things, including the privileging of reason, mind, etc., are things that are created or constructed from a masculine point of view. Instead of that, they want to foreground what they consider the feminine aspect of language and the feminine aspect of these oppositions by inverting these oppositions. French feminists also see both the female body and women's writing as sites of jouissance. And jouissance is a French term which basically means something like bliss or ecstasy, an extreme intense pleasure. And it's a French term, but it is usually used in psychoanalytic theory, and it was popularized by the psychoanalytic theorist Jacques Lacan to refer to an extreme unsettling enjoyment that is beyond pleasure. So pleasure is something that just makes you happy. You are comfortable when you are feeling pleasure. But according to these psychoanalytic theorists, there is some kind of a pleasure that is beyond ordinary pleasure, some kind of an enjoyment that is beyond ordinary pleasure. It is like when pleasure reaches a certain point, it becomes almost pain. And jouissance is positioned at exactly that point where pleasure is so intense that it is almost pain. So that is why we say that it is a pleasure that goes beyond pleasure. And many of these French feminists actually used the orgasm as a metaphor for this jouissance. So that was like the experience of orgasm by a woman is something that they compare to this idea. They used it as an example for this idea of jouissance. And then they also went on to say that writing, expressing yourself through creative writing, is also another form of jouissance. Of the four different theorists that we mentioned in French feminism, one of the most important ones is Elaine Sisu, who is most famous for her essay, The Laugh of the Medusa, published in 1976. In this essay, Sisu she proposes a new kind of writing, a new kind of language called écriture féminine. Écriture féminine is a French term which basically literally means feminine writing. Écriture is writing and écriture féminine is feminine writing. It was inspired by, again, psychoanalytic theorist Jacques Lacan's idea that language is phallogocentric in structure. The structure of language is phallogocentric. Phallogocentric basically means that the phallus, which means the power of men, and the logos, which is a word or reason, are central to language. So language, ordinary language, is structured in such a way that it privileges the male perspective, it gives power to men, and it privileges reason over emotion, etc. Having said that language is phallogocentric, one can go on to criticize it and to propose. So, if the existing language is phallogocentric, then if that is patriarchal, then what do you propose as an alternative? And therefore, Sisu proposed écriture feminine as a pre-Oedipal language, which undermines the notion of fixed signification in language and reveals the joyous free play of meanings. So, if you look up psychoanalytic theory of Sigmund Freud, you will know about this Oedipal stage that a boy child supposedly goes through. Before the Oedipal stage, the boy child is very happy being at one with the mother, but at this particular Oedipal stage, the boy realizes that he and the mother are two completely different beings, and then he realizes that he is similar to his father in a physical sense, and he is very different from his mother, and he starts fearing the mother because he realizes that his father is the one with the phallus, which, with all the power, which is expressed or which is represented physically, biologically by the male sexual organ, and the mother doesn't have this particular phallus, which means that she doesn't have power in the family or in society. But again, that is physically, biologically represented by her lack of this particular organ. And because of that, the boy child worries that the mother has been castrated by the father. This is called the castration complex, and then he wishes to become like the father because he's afraid that if he doesn't obey the law of the father, he himself will also be castrated just like the mother, which, to put it very simply, just means that every child, or at least every boy child, as Freud was talking mostly about the psychosexual development of boys, every child grows up and realizes that their father is the one with power and the mother is the one who doesn't have any power. So obviously they want to be more like the father. They want to have some kind of power for themselves. They don't want to be powerless by the mother because they fear that they will become oppressed in society, and therefore they reject the mother and they try to become more and more like the father. Now, this happens from the Oedipal stage onwards. But Sisu says that that is where children start acquiring this language which is phallogocentric in structure. This patriarchal language is something children at a certain point of time start talking. Right, that is when they acquire language, and it is from that moment that they are conditioned by society to behave in a particular way. So the ideology of patriarchy becomes entrenched in the child through language. But écriture feminine, according to Sisu, draws on a pre-Oedipal language from a time before this Oedipal stage where the child and the mother are one rather than two. Now, we already spoke about two strands in feminism, which can be more or less territorially, geographically divided as Anglo-American feminism and French feminism. But apart from that, another way of dividing second wave feminism is into three main currents. That of course there are many more divisions or many other groups of feminists who were part of second wave feminism, and we will discuss these in some more detail in another video. But for now, let us look at three main currents that existed throughout second wave feminism. The first one is called liberal feminism. This is also called mainstream feminism. Liberal feminism aimed at integrating women into the existing power structures without questioning those power structures. And they wanted to get more women into positions that were usually dominated by men. And the means that they use for this, the methods that they use for this, were basically legislation at the institutional level or the governmental level. So, for example, wanting more women to have representation in parliament, wanting more women to reach managerial positions in business organizations. These were some of the things that liberal feminists were interested in. So they would not question the very structuring of those institutions. For example, if you look at parliament, if you look at being the president of America, for example, which by until now no woman has ever been the president of the United States, but this is something that liberal feminists would be interested in having. They would be interested in having a president of the United States, but that doesn't mean that they would change any of the power structures. They just want women to occupy those positions of power which until then were occupied by men. In opposition to this, we have radical feminism, which aimed at completely restructuring the institutions of society because they considered all the institutions of society to be inherently patriarchal. They argued that women's subservient role in society was too closely woven into the social fabric to be unraveled without a revolutionary revamping of society itself. അപ്പോൾ സൊസൈറ്റിയിലെ patriarchal സൊസൈറ്റിയിലെ പേട്രിയാർക്കലായ ഇൻസ്റ്റിറ്റ്യൂഷൻസിനെ അതുപോലെ നിലനിർത്തിക്കൊണ്ട് നമുക്ക് വിമൻസ് we cannot have an improvement in women's condition if we keep the institutions of society as they are, because those institutions are inherently patriarchal. The only way to change women's subservient role, being like almost like a servant to men, that kind of a gender role that we have in society can be changed only if we completely revamp, completely break apart and remake all the social institutions that exist today. So radical feminism, again, we will look in more detail at radical feminism in the next video, but this is how they differ from liberal feminism. But radical feminism also had its opponents in a new strand which was called cultural feminism. And cultural feminists rejected the notion that men and women are intrinsically the same. This was a notion that many feminists had been foregrounding until then by saying that men and women are not fundamentally any different and we should be given equality. But cultural feminists said that that is not actually true, that there is actually a biological difference between men and women, which leads to certain cultural qualities being associated with both men and women. And cultural feminists said that, so in this sense, until this point, by acknowledging that there is a difference between men and women, a fundamental, essential difference, they are going with what even patriarchy has been saying. But what patriarchy does then is to say that men and all the qualities that are associated with men are automatically better than women. But cultural feminism inverts that and says that there are certain qualities that are associated with women which we consider feminine qualities, like women being very nurturing, they are very caring, they are good at affective relationships, at emotional relationships, and all these kind of things are these are also qualities of women that patriarchy will acknowledge, but they always consider it to be slightly less important than the masculine qualities. Cultural feminism, on the other hand, says that yes, these are the qualities associated with women, these are the feminine qualities, and we should celebrate those qualities. So rather than saying that men and women are exactly the same, we should acknowledge that men and women are completely different, and then we should invert the power structure by celebrating the qualities associated with women. All these different currents have their own criticisms, but these were some important currents during second wave feminism. Second wave feminism, just like first wave feminism, had to face a lot of criticisms, and the main criticism was exactly the same that the first wave feminists faced, which is that second wave feminism was a monolithic entity. Monolithic meaning very homogeneous, like it is composed of only one type of people or one type of women, and it did not take the plurality of women into consideration. Actual women are very different. They come from different races, different classes, they come from different countries, they speak different languages, their problems are different. So this plurality of women, the plurality of the experience of women was not given much importance by second wave feminism. Instead, they try to think about all women as a singular monolithic entity. The experience of all women are the same. When you say that women are different from men, essentially, then you are saying that all women are similar, all women are the same. But that doesn't take the plurality of women's experience into consideration. This is a critique that was posed by Amelia Jones and many other people. Again, in second wave feminism, just like in first wave feminism, certain sections of women were still privileged, and this mostly included heterosexuals, white women, and middle class women from the first world countries. So, the problems of other people, including homosexuals, including the non white, the other races, including women from the lower classes, the working classes, and women from the third world, were not given any importance. And specifically there was a criticism that it was mostly again a white women's movement, and it did not pay any attention to the issues that are specific to women of color. And an important example is something that Angela Davis criticized second wave feminism for, which is that second wave feminists protested for reproductive rights. They wanted women to have, we have already mentioned this, they wanted women to have control over their own body and to have access to contraception and access to safe and legal abortion facilities. But Angela Davis pointed out that, but these are not the problems faced by black people. These are some problems. They also don't have access to these kind of facilities, but they have a bigger problem, which was the forced sterilization of black people in many places in the United States. And Angela Davis said we should fight against that. But the white second wave feminists did not think that it was an important issue because it did not relate to them specifically. They were not threatened by the issue of forced sterilization. It was something that only affected black people. So the white feminists, the mainstream feminists, did not include those kind of issues in their campaigns for sexual freedom and for reproductive rights. So these were again some of the problems that were pointed out against second wave feminism, and many of those would come to be expressed in more detail when we discuss the third wave of feminism. But before that, in the next video lesson, we will look at certain other strands of second wave feminism, like radical feminism, which we have already just mentioned, but we will go into that in a bit more detail. And then there are other strands of second wave feminism, like Marxist feminism, psychoanalytic feminism, and lesbian feminism, which all came during that time, which all rose to prominence, but which had very slightly different, each of them had a different orientation towards the very question of feminism and women's rights. So we will look at that in the next video. Thank you.